Good evening, everyone. My name is Greg Sterling. I'm the Dean of Yale Divinity School, just up the street, and a member of the Terry Committee. And on behalf of the committee, it is a distinct pleasure to welcome you to the second of the Terry Lectures in 2018. And as was true after the first lecture, there will be a Q&A period. I will invite you, if you would, when you have a question, to come up to the mic and introduce yourself briefly and pose your question. And following the lectureship, not like most years, we actually have another reception. So you'll have a chance to visit with one another following the lecture tonight. Introducing Tom Lovejoy presents an interesting dilemma. On the one hand, he's such an important figure that he deserves a full introduction. On the other hand, you didn't come here to hear about Tom Lovejoy. You came here to hear Tom Lovejoy. So allow me to compromise by offering some select pieces of information that will contextualize the lecture. Known as the godfather of biodiversity, how else would a divinity school dean introduce him? His career choice was made very early in life, in high school, when he worked for the Trevor Zoo while attending Millbrook School. This is the only accredited zoo on a high school campus in the United States. I don't know how many species they had when you were a student there, but today they have more than 80 species and 180 exotic and indigenous animals, 9 of whom are on the endangered list. And that experience of working with different species captivated his mind. He came to Yale, where he studied with G. Evelyn Hutchinson, the founder of modern ecology, Dylan Ripley, an ornithologist and the former director of the Peabody, and Philip Humphrey, who introduced him to the Amazon, the region of his life's work. He is unlimited, and maybe I should even say unlimitable, by a single sphere of work: scientist, government advisor, and environmentalist. As a scientist, he is most famous for his concept or development of the concept of biodiversity, a term that he coined in a report to President Carter in 1980. In a separate publication of the same year, he wrote, "Hundreds of thousands of species will perish, and this reduction of 10 to 20% of the world's biota will occur in about half a human lifespan. This reduction of the biological diversity of the planet is the most basic issue of our time." And if you were here last Thursday, you know that that issue has only become even more urgent. He has done, however, more than to point out and analyze the crisis that we face. He's offered practical solutions, some of which have garnered a great deal of attention, the most famous of which was his debt for nature swaps, in which he proposed groups of wealthy conservationists purchase the national debt of underdeveloped countries and then use the funds from that debt that was purchased to purchase tracts of lands that would be environmentally protected. He is an example of a scientist who not only does research, but has made policy suggestions that have captured a good deal of attention. Now, I haven't mentioned his academic appointment at George Mason, his 10-plus books, his service to 3 presidents of the United States, his work at the Smithsonian or the United Nations Foundation, his role with the famous series Nature, his 5 or more international awards. When I say international, I mean truly international, or the fact that he's a Wilbur Cross recipient from this university as one of our own. But there's one award that I need to mention. In 2004, Reinhold Zuniga discovered a new species of wasps in Costa Rica. The National Biodiversity Institute named it Polycyrtus Lovejoy in honor of our speaker. In this second of 3 Terry lectures for the year, he will address the issue of fragmenting creation. I am assuming that just as he provided a fresh look at biodiversity in the first lecture, he will offer us insights into the fragmentation of habitats, a concept that he has formally addressed since 1978 and that poses one of the greatest challenges to biodiversity. And like you, I am ready and anxious to hear him.
Thank you.
Professor Lovejoy.
Thank you very much. So I probably should explain where the phrase, the godfather of biodiversity, came from. It's when somebody introduced me as the father of biological diversity, and I said, no, that's biologically impossible, right? So last week, we explored essentially the state of biodiversity and how it relates to the value systems of the great religions of the planet, and basically began to ask the question, how do we embed human aspiration in nature? What I want to do this evening is look at one particular aspect of it, the way we fragment habitats, which we do almost anywhere humans occur in the planet, but also some first thoughts about how do we stitch it back together again? How can we begin the whole exercise of regreening the Emerald Planet, a big part of which will be in Thursday's talk. So this is a sequence of forest cover from about 1945, if I remember right, in the Atlantic forest of Brazil, up until, looks like, 1974. This is a typical pattern that occurs wherever people are occupying landscapes. Natural habitat is removed, and almost always a consequence of that is that a fair amount of that habitat ends up as fragments. And here you can see it in a famous figure from both the paper and the book, MacArthur and Wilson's Island Biogeography. We're looking at a township in Wisconsin from 1831 on the upper left down through 1950 on the lower right. And interestingly enough, habitat fragmentation simply was not considered a serious conservation issue. And that's because most of the consequences of fragmentation play out over time. And so people really don't get to see sort of the entire consequence of habitat fragmentation. And it was only with the publication of Island Biogeography that people began to think about it. Well, these are 3 statistics that will tell you how widespread forest fragmentation is. That 70% of remaining forest is within 1 kilometer of the forest edge, half within 500 meters, and much of the fragments are really small, around 10 hectares. So I was looking at the numbers of species on islands that MacArthur and Wilson began to develop their perspective on what sets the number of species on islands. It certainly was very obvious that bigger islands had more species than smaller islands, as we're looking at here in the West Indies. And you can plot them as, proper statistical analyses, but it's the same result. Bigger islands have more species than smaller islands. But looking at all of that, it was really hard to sort of puzzle out what was going on. It's when you looked at the difference between continental islands. Let's get what we had before. I guess we're going to see this twice. So when you look at continental islands, ones that originally were connected to a mainland, like Trinidad to South America, and compare them to a similar-sized island which has never been connected to a big piece of continent, you find that the continental islands have a smaller number of species than, or a greater number of species than oceanic islands, the ones that have always been separate. And then if you look at the comparable piece of mainland to a continental island, you see that the continental island has fewer species than the equivalent piece of habitat on the mainland. So those observations led to this consideration that actually the number of species you may find on an island is actually dynamic. That, in fact, what's going on is that continental islands start off, so when Trinidad was isolated, essentially with an equivalent number of species to the equivalent area on the mainland. And those declined in number until eventually they approached something like an oceanic island. So that raised a big conservation question. To what extent can numbers of species on islands inform us about what happens to habitat islands that are left by human impact on the environment? And so that's the current version of the famous book, which I first saw when I was actually living in the Amazon for my PhD thesis. And this basically was the proposition that the number of species you found on a particular island was a consequence of this graph of an equilibrium between the immigration of new species and species extinction on the particular islands. And finally, getting a little bit beyond theory, there were some islands where there actually were some data. And foremost amongst those was Barra Colorado Island in the Panama Canal Zone, created in the 19-teens or thereabouts for the Panama Canal. It's studied by ornithologists over the decades since then. And it was very clear that in the 1920s there were 208 species of birds on Barra Colorado, which had declined by 1970 to a smaller number. And in this analysis done by Ed Willis, he determined that 45 of the species that went extinct did so because Barra Colorado Island was not big enough to support them over time. So as one begins to think about the implications for conservation and national park design and the rest, you can see that this kind of thinking in the early 1970s really began to get everybody's attention. And there were different data sets. This is looking at chaparral habitats, which are sort of islands and canyons in San Diego County. And if you look at them over time, as they become isolated, they actually decline in the number of species. And then you could look at forests sort of almost woodlots in Sao Paulo state, and imagine how the current bird diversity got there from some unknown original bird diversity. And similarly, how the abundance of some of these species actually declined over time. But nobody really knew what the original state of all those places were, except for Barrow, Colorado. And there was a heated debate like you can only have in academia when there's no direct data. I mean, it was a white-hot debate. It's called, what's better, a single large protected area or several small ones? And it was really incandescent. One pole of that controversy with Daniel Simberloff, who in fact was quite correct in his assertion that island biogeography was actually neutral in terms of one large versus several small. But that was island biogeography theory as opposed to the way communities are put together. And they're just simply not put together randomly. I was working for the World Wildlife Fund, advancing projects to the board for approval. And I realized that until we understood what habitat fragmentation actually does, that we really basically didn't know whether any of those projects would be successful in the end. So I worried that topic. Everybody knew I was worrying that topic like a dog worries a bone. And the Monday before Christmas in 1976, I went over to a meeting at the National Science Foundation at the invitation of my good friend Fran James. John Brooks, formerly from Yale, was there, and Dan Simberloff was there. And that's where, for whatever reason, I came out with, I wonder if you could persuade the Brazilians to arrange the 50% of forest, which they then required be left intact in any project in the Amazon. I wonder if you could persuade them to arrange the 50% to have a giant experiment. And so that was the origin of something I've now worked on almost 39 years. It is the Forest Fragments Project north of Manaus. The city there is Manaus. There's a highway going straight north, and somewhere up to its right, you'll begin to see some clearings and maybe some fragments within it. But this will give you a better view of that a little bit later. NSF actually didn't think I could pull this off, but they bought me an air ticket. And knowing Brazil, having lived there for 2 or 3 years, I think helped a lot. Within the first hour at the National Institute for Amazon Research, I had their agreement. And later that afternoon, I had the agreement of the authority that controlled the land. Then I had to make it happen, and that wasn't simple. But anyway, so that's how it was all laid out at the beginning. And this had the advantage that basically none of the previous studies had, that we could study what would become fragments while they were still part of continuous forest. And we could also have matching plots in continuous forest so that if we found something was changing both in the fragments and in the continuous forest, we would know that is coming from something other than habitat fragmentation. And this is it quite early on. That's a 10-hectare fragment. And I think that's a 1 and a 10-hectare fragment. You can see all the forest that's been cut down. It's about to be burned. They were turning it into cattle pasture, which doesn't make any ecological or economic sense, but there were subsidies that made it economically workable. And there's one of the first 10-hectare fragments with a figure well known at the time for wildlife ecology, named Raymond Dasman. So I'm not going to take you through a lot of graphs, but there were some really interesting things that just popped up and surprised us to begin with. So this is the capture rate of birds in mist nets in 4 different fragments to be and then fragments. And there was this enormous increase after fragmentation. Well, what was happening was there was actually a huge refugee effect from the surrounding forest as it was cut down, and they went into the only remaining forest. But one of them actually didn't show much of a refugee effect. And that's the exception that, in a sense, proves the case, because it's this one, where basically, although we had 100 meters cleared around it, the birds that were in that 100 meters, when it came down, had that much bigger piece of forest to be absorbed by. So much less of a refugee effect. And then another big surprise, the number of butterfly species declined initially and then recovered and then kept increasing. And actually, what was happening was the relatively rare butterfly species that are part of little treefall gaps in the forest had found these enormous treeless gaps around the fragments and were just exploding in population and then invading the fragments. So even though it looked like the forest interior species were increasing, it wasn't the forest interior species. It was essentially the exotics from treefall gaps. And another result that we didn't anticipate was just how vulnerable these fragments would be to wind shear and storms and the like. And basically, the smaller fragments, the ones and tens, lost up to 35% of their biomass and never were able to recover it. And this will give you a dramatic example. This is the center trail of a 10-hectare reserve after a big storm. No longer a forest. So what about the birds in these forests? So what you can see is that the control plots in continuous forests have more bird species in them than the fragments. And that comes because they're isolated and because they wink out. And actually, what's going on in a simple kind of way is just like a radioactive mineral loses radioactivity and declines to a simpler state, these forest communities are losing species and declining to a simpler state. So this will give you a really dramatic view of that, about the proportion extinct relative to the size of the fragment. But it took us more than 20 years to get this next result, which was sort of looking at something like a half-life. And basically what we found was that birds of the forest interior, like this white-crowned antbird, which are birds which do not go out into the sunlight. They will never go out of the forest and into the sunlight. Darkness is their cue. Half of the forest interior bird species were lost from a 100-hectare fragment in less than 15 years. So that's a pretty dramatic conclusion, but it took us about 20 years to get there. And then, in the way the world works, things changed. And the subsidy which had encouraged the cattle ranchers to try and do miserable cattle ranching were removed. And basically the ranches were largely abandoned, and suddenly we were facing second growth coming up around our isolated fragments. And it could get pretty dramatic. So this is what 12-year-old second growth looks like around one of these fragments. We have systematically re-isolated our fragments 3 times already. The last was about 3 years ago. And this is actually what it looks like for one 10-hectare fragment, a drone shot, essentially 4 years later. It had all been completely cut down right up to the edge of the fragment 4 years before. And so we began to learn some other things which were interesting that we hadn't anticipated being able to learn. And one was that we actually had 2 different kinds of vegetational succession going on. One, the classic one of these forests, dominated by Cecropia, but the second, dominated by a genus called Vismia, which is quite toxic, reproduces by vegetative reproduction, and comes up almost in monoculture. And you get very different occupation of that second growth by birds as a consequence. So if it's not burned, it's just looking at capture rate, you get a lot more than if it is burned, and you get larger number of species. So I think I've made enough of a case now that habitat fragmentation is a serious conservation issue. I'd like to spend the remainder of this talk talking about how can we start stitching back all these fragments that we've created in landscapes all around the world. And as I thought about it, there almost needs to be a science of connecting or reconnecting. I mean, we have parts of it. There is a science of ecological restoration. There's the interesting things that are done by people here at Yale, like David Skelly, the little modifications that make it easier for frogs to return to what otherwise seem perfectly fine water bodies. The kind of landscape planning that's going on here. But I think there is an overall science that needs to be put together so that we can start doing these connections in a large scale. So nobody has ever done the experiment of taking 2 fragments and reconnecting them with natural vegetation and actually studying all the bird species, for example, that take advantage of that. So I'm now going to show you some examples where that was done in terms of stitching it back together, but it was all about particular rare bird species and improving their overall amount of habitat and not looking at the overall complex of change that must go on when you do a reconnection. So these next slides are courtesy of Stuart Pym, who's developed an entire specialty of basically helping the conservation of rare bird species by literally doing this reconnecting. One of the places he's done it is in the Atlantic forest of Brazil. The red is the greater number of threatened bird species. And that's the habitat which is important for those bird species. And you can see he's identified a bunch of potential linkages that might be reestablished. And so that's it looking at Google Earth. And you're going to see some of this actually getting done. So this is essentially the beforehand in 2007 on the upper left and 2018 on the lower right, where they've actually managed to start some pretty successful reforestation to connect 2 remaining fragments. That's it in 2007, and that's it as it's recovering. And there you have a good shot of it. And what do you do when you have a situation like this with a major highway? Well, actually, you can build an overpass. And that actually has been done. And one of the things I was delighted to learn about 6, 7, 8 years ago, interstate highway funds can actually be spent on building overpasses and underpasses for wildlife. I was thinking you'd have to change the law, but no, it's already in there. It's even been done a few times. And here it's even being done in Beijing. And here's an interesting example I ran into essentially a week or two back. It's looking at a very big landscape in southern Africa, basically 5 countries with really important features like the Okavango Delta, substantial percentages of remaining cheetah and lions, et cetera, in southern Africa. And they're actually working with those 5 sovereign governments, World Wildlife Fund, to begin to essentially guarantee the long-term connection of those wildlife populations. This is not what they want to get to finally, but this is how far they're getting already. So that leads me to actually make the point that one of our serious problems in the world, and one of the things that creates a lot of fragments, is sort of the heedless way we build infrastructure. And this is a classic pattern in the Brazilian Amazon where one road starts and then it has little side roads. It's called the Fishbone Pattern. And all kinds of unanticipated things happen as a consequence, including the use of fire. So there is actually already a strong effort, not strong enough, to develop sustainable infrastructure, which may seem like an oxymoron. But I was at a meeting a year or two ago with the Brazilian National Development Bank. They were talking about repaving or paving the last 300 kilometers of a road from Porto Velho to Manaus, which is a really bad idea. And I said, well, you know, if you really, really, really need that road, why don't you build an elevated road? And then an hour and a half later in the program, up pops this road in the Atlantic forest of Brazil. It's called Imigrantes. Its impact on the ground is 2.5% of a conventional highway. It does cost more to build, for sure. But if you actually calculate in the maintenance, it's likely that the maintenance costs on a standard highway would be really high in the wet tropics, and for something that's built of concrete like this, quite low. So it's probably competitive, and as you can see, it does wonders for natural connectivity. So this is another view of all of that. And then I want to just spend the remaining time talking about natural connections which naturally occur if not interfered with in the landscape, namely riparian vegetation, the vegetation that grows along water courses. And I've got a lot of pretty pictures of that. But I first got my attention paid to that when I was Bruce Babbitt's science advisor, and they were working on the Northwest Forest Plan, and he sent me out to see how it was going. And they were deciding at that time just how wide the band would be along water courses to be essentially no touch, to create the kind of habitat that salmon love. They just love all kinds of dead trees and stuff that have fallen into the stream. And as I looked at it, I saw this incredible amount of connection that would put back into the landscape. And so I became really interested in riparian vegetation as one way to do that. And in particular, I became really sort of fascinated with the way very often a landowner will graze cattle right up to the edge of the watercourse or plow right up to the edge of the watercourse, wanting to maximize every square meter of land they have. But of course, what's happening is they're losing their soil by the cubic meter. They really did an economic analysis. They wouldn't want to do that. And interestingly enough, I went to Peoria, Illinois for a Caterpillar Corporation sustainability meeting, and that time my taxi driver was a local farmer, third generation, making a little extra change, and he just volunteered, that everybody out there was doing no-till. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. Central Illinois, no-till. And on the same trip, I learned that there had been so much soil erosion over time that the local government had found it worth its while to spend more millions of dollars than I can remember anymore to actually dredge it back out of the river and sell it back to the farmers. So I think riparian vegetation is well worth having a major global campaign for, and we'll just see some really nice examples, courtesy of the National Geographic. So these are some of the things that I think habitat fragmentation and developing an agenda for reducing the amount of fragmentation in the natural world can involve. And it's just beginning, I think. We haven't done a lot of the science yet. Sometimes it can be a mistake to do. I remember a proposal to reconnect two wild areas in southern Africa that looked like it would actually introduce rinderpest to a region where it had been eliminated. So there's a lot to learn about it. But I think as we look forward to how we can actually have human aspiration better embedded in nature, stitching the pieces back together and celebrating riparian vegetation is part of the way to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Lovejoy. So now we have an opportunity for you to interact, and I would ask you to come here and pose your question. Would you please identify yourself first? And my favorite line is, oh, yeah, that does need to be on. Please disguise your comment as a question so that others can also ask questions. So the floor is open.
Indeed.
Sure. I was fascinated.
Can you come here so they can catch you on film as well?
Yuck. Okay. I was fascinated by your scientific experiment being ruined by the regrowing forest. And I wonder if you would just talk a little bit about what it's like to work in a foreign country doing an experiment that is so big, where you have to do things like isolate your habitat if you want to study it and keep it from regrowing. Would you just talk about the logistics of that?
It's always an adventure, right? But basically, I think we've been able to actually manage the regrowth problem enough that the basic experiment goes ahead. But there's really interesting information in terms of the things that will actually use that second growth while it's there. And then, you go back and reset by doing the isolation. So it's not always been easy in terms of trying to do a project in the middle of the Amazon in Brazil. Brazil is not got a great reputation for welcoming crowds of foreign researchers. But it helped, amongst other things, that, I spoke Portuguese. Everybody can tell I love Brazil when I'm there. I mean, how can you not? And because it was science, it was much easier to do than just jumping into something that might be closer to policy. And one of the things that was absolutely fascinating about it is that even before we had any results, because we were asking this question, all the protected areas being created in the Brazilian Amazon were large. I mean, it's like we could be drinking beer out in the forest and still affecting public policy. And they had a very wise first Secretary of the Environment named Paulo Nogueira Neto, who was in office for, I think, something like 12 years. He presided over the creation of some of the best environmental law in Latin America. During his time period, he protected huge areas, which he was able to get set aside. And Paulo almost became like a father figure to me. And he's still alive, right? And, I would always talk to him on Christmas Eve, which is their holiday. And not more than a minute or two would go by, then he would want to talk about environment and science, right? And so one of the wonderful things he did a year before or months before leaving office, he said, give me all the coordinates of your reserves, which I did. And he turned them into a presidential decree. So this is part of the Brazilian protected area system. Now, I've had some hard times. There was some wacko person who accused me of being a bio-pirate, right? And I used to joke about I was going to get a green pirate's hat. Right? And it actually led to a parliamentary inquiry, which of course found nothing. But you always, you have to have friends in lots of places. So,
It's about relationships.
yeah, including in the Brazilian media. And so, I mean, like today, I was telling the students at lunch, I had an article appear in the Folha of Sao Paulo, which is the largest circulation newspaper in Brazil, about, I think it's time we modernize the infrastructure plans for the Amazon, because they're really all 50 years old. And you have to think about what you're trying to achieve, and then think about ways to design it that has much less impact. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Lovejoy, for such an illuminating talk. I'm John Grimm here at the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and Yale Divinity School with a joint degree program on religion and ecology. And I wanted to draw you out. When you initiated the study of fragments in the Amazon, where Camp 41 is located, as I recall, what kind of conversations did you have with the ranchers and farmers in the region that drew them into
really good question.
participating in this program? What kind of values appealed to them?
Well, you know, that's a really, really interesting question. And it helped that, in fact, we weren't taking anything away from anybody. They had to leave 50% in forest. And we actually did them enormous favors by getting in there and studying sort of the lay of the land, which they had no idea about. So we could tell them where the streams were and where the flat places were. And so they got some benefits from that as well. And it's something that is very Brazilian. They liked the idea that they were part of something that was getting a lot of attention, right? So none of those original owners are there anymore. And I actually worry about the long-term security of those plots. So I'm trying to look for a way to turn it into a much larger protected area and play into the interests of the governor of that state in developing a serious ecotourism agency or business. So anyway, Jean.
Thank you, Tom. That was wonderful. Jean Thompson, Black, Yale University Press. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about invasive species. I love the example of the riparian habitats, but systems I'm most familiar with, say out west, where there are issues with, say, tamarisk or Russian olive. Do you have comparable issues in Brazil, either in the Atlantic forest or the Amazon, of invasive species having to be factored in? And how do you view the issue of invasive species in general as we look at this process of stitching back?
Well, it's a real issue, and some are more invasive than others. Some are easier to actually keep under some kind of moderate control without a lot of work, and then others aren't. So in the Amazon, there are hardly any invasive species. They haven't actually been able to get there. It's certainly probably different in the Atlantic forest region of Brazil, and there's just endless amounts of bracken fern, which is an invasive. But at least up in the north, it's not such a serious issue.
So for the past 4 years, I was working for the São Paulo State Secretary of Environment, and
There you have to wait for a microphone.
Thank you. Working. So I'm going to repeat the question. For the past 4 years, I was working for the São Paulo State Secretary of Environment, and a discussion that we would get a lot is creating additional protected areas to connect fragments that we have in the São Paulo State, which are a lot. And one of the main criticisms that we would hear is that instead of creating extra protected areas and parks, it would be better to focus on our efforts and our resource on taking care of the areas that we already have. So I would love to hear your opinion on that, relationship between spending resources and effort on areas that are already created and not getting a lot of attention versus creating extra areas.
So my attitude of that kind of a question is that's actually a budget issue, right? And if you can increase the budget, then you don't have to make those kinds of unnecessary trade-offs. that might not actually get you very far in a particular place. And you know, I'm acutely aware that a lot of the protected areas in the Brazilian Amazon are actually almost, you know, with only one or two people looking after them. They're classic paper parks. You know, I don't worry about them right now because they're just so isolated. There are no immediate threats. But that's not always going to be the case. And that's why there have been major programs like the Amazon Region Protected Area 1 and 2 created to help with all of that. So my first instinct, without knowing any of the details of this sort of binary choice, is that some of those fragments actually might be more important to spend money on, at least in the short term, to get them secured one way or another. And yes, if you have a protected area state park somewhere that's having a serious invasion problem, not from invasive species, but from people, well, then maybe you do actually need to do something there. São Paulo state is such an interesting state because they decided, I don't know when this was, 40 years ago, that they wanted to have something like the National Science Foundation. It's called FAPESP. It's a classic Brazilian acronym. And it doesn't have to go for an appropriation every year. It, by the state constitution, gets 1% of the state revenue. And actually, in the first years after setting that up, they didn't pass any of the revenue on, and then some governor discovered that, and so there was a lot of backlog that was all given to FAPESP at once, and so they have an endowment as well as this 1%. Well, the consequence is that you get really high quality, sustained science and science projects supported by FAPESP. And you know, maybe we need to look for something like that for protection of protected areas.
Dr. Lovejoy, thank you for a great presentation. My name is Helen Gichohi. I am a Klasky fellow who's out here in Yale for about 3 months. I had the fortune of working in one of the landscapes that you presented, the Kazungula, the Kaza.
Cool.
Happened, and also to put together some of the habitat corridors that are used by elephants in that area. But my question has to do with the forests. Oftentimes the fragmentation, as you showed in your earlier slides, is significantly far along that fragments, that the restoration doesn't occur naturally. The stitching back does not occur naturally. And I'm wondering whether you've had occasion to work in forests where people have had to help stitch back the forest fragments so that you could actually create those reconnections, and how different that might be with the natural regeneration.
Yeah. It's a really good question. I've been asked many times why we didn't include some stitching back experiments in what we were doing. And the answer is very simple. We had so much to do just looking at learning about fragmentation firsthand that it would have been beyond our ability to add anything more. But there are many wonderful things that have come from this project, other than answering some of these questions and producing some of the science. And that is, we produced close to 200 PhDs and master's degrees, and at least half of those are Brazilian. And as I said at lunch today, and they grow up and they get grown-up jobs. Right? So one of them was actually head of conservation for the entire state of Amazonas, which is the largest political unit in South America other than a country. it's 2.3 times the size of Texas. And the one place in the Amazon where a highway has not led to massive deforestation is in southern Amazonas, where Rita, who you met, where Rita set up a whole bunch of protected areas. And it's not that there isn't some tension and problem there and need for enforcement and the like, but it actually has been working. So.
We're going to be short on time, so we have two questions. Would you both ask your question, and we'll let Professor Lovejoy respond to both of you. So, Mary Evelyn, and then...
Thank you so much, Tom. Wonderful talk. Mary Evelyn Tucker, Forestry and Environmental Studies in Yale Divinity School. You've spent a good part of your career navigating between science and policy. And as president of Conservation Biology, you did a wonderful editorial on how science has got to come into the space of policy and even, dare I say, advocacy. It seems as though over your career, science has come a long way, and you've been instrumental in that, towards science for solutions. But there's still obstacles to that, objectivity, distance, empirical studies, versus actually saying what is needed. I just wonder if you can comment on this science policy dance.
So, and the other question.
And
yes.
Just a rider on that, the science is really good at sort of figuring out what we need to do or hypothesizing what we might want to do. But it sounds like you have a lot of experience working with local municipalities and state governments. So I was wondering if you could share some advice or what some of your successes have been based on in getting people on board with the why we should care about these things.
Well, there was one big plus working in favor of all of this is that the Brazilian ministries have tended to be very technocratic, and they really want to know the science. So that helps. And I personally have never seen any problem between, saying, this is the science, this is what we've discovered, this is what it means, like we did just now. And then, saying, I think this is the way we need to start talking about what this might mean for changing the way we might do things for the better. And it's always a lot of listening. Got to do a lot of listening, right?
Would you join me in thanking Professor Lovejoy?